The Paperclip Murders, Chapter 19, The Long Kill Goodnight. It took the cops the better part of 20 minutes to get to my place, survey the damage, call in the meat wagons, and begin the inevitable roundup of the bodies. I spent 10 minutes of that buffer eliciting answers from Sow Killer, and then I spent the next 10 minutes smoking under his streetlight, wishing I'd never gotten the answers I had. The puffs of bubbly air he could squeak from his lungs spelled a death sentence for him in crimson letters. But the words he formed with those puffs created an altogether different kind of sentence. Sentences, really. Sentences that gnarled and garbled and straightened themselves back out, and led to questions that birthed more answers, that impregnated more sentences, until it was one giant, freakish, self-impregnating elephant in the room that spelled a specifically bad sentence, for Woodchuck, for my conscience, and most of all for the Paperclip killer. I stubbed out my cigarette butt against the street pole I was back under, watching the cops and the paramedics do their work, having already given my statement, and I thought back to what the clown had told me. Apparently, clowns have names, just like real people. Who knew, right? Anyway, the clown's name was Alec, though honestly I prefer to think of him as Sow Killer. Alec succumbed to the depth of my charm, and to a couple of fingers plugging one or two of the bullet holes in his soon-to-be corpse, and told me what I needed to know. He knew to come to my house and initiate the circus rendition of War and Peace because he'd been following me. He'd been following me, trying to make certain that my investigation wasn't going to be leading anywhere, and when he heard me spouting off to Sal about my leads, he felt he had to take action. And he felt he had to take action because he didn't want me to find out who was behind the deaths of Hennessy and Brock. And why is that, you and I may ask? Because he loved the woman who was behind it. While he spoke, the gears began whirring, the pieces began to click into place, and before he'd reached the end of the story, he expired, but my steel trap of a brain filled in the missing bits. Alec had met a woman a few years ago, who had literally joined the circus when it had come through town. This woman was running from something, and he wanted to protect her. She had terrible, dark secrets, and he eventually found out that men had done awful things to her and then had tried to simply delete her from life. This mystery woman began studying under one of the circus showmen, and learned all manner of chemical secrets from a freak show bearded lady. Secrets the beard had claimed to have learned from the dark continents, from all manner of drum-banging, rattle-shaking peoples outside of this fair nation. And when the circus returned to town, years later, the mystery woman had read in the paper about Hennessy and Brock, getting out yet another scandal involving a likely unwilling woman. And she had vowed to herself, and to Alec, that she would stop the men who had harmed her from ever harming another woman. Alec wanted to stop her, but she begged him not to get in her way. And what could the poor sod do? After all, he'd been killed by love, the greatest poison there is. Once that gets into your system, all hope is lost. So then Alec's skirt began knocking off the two men she hated most in life, getting to them in an inconspicuous manner. I should have known, when I first discovered it was poison. Poison is a dame's game, sure as blackjacking, just cards. But the identity of this mystery woman, it chilled me to the core. Samantha. And it wasn't just the name, it was his description of her. To a T, it was Angel Face, the woman I'd seen in Woodchuck's office building several times. She'd come back under an assumed name and a different appearance, gotten a job in the mailroom of the building, and from there she could easily deliver her deadly paperclips. Oh, and I suppose you saw it all coming, right, know-it-all? What have I got in my pocket, then? That's right, shut your pie hole. I finished reminiscing and looked back at my house, which was actually more like a gazebo now. The meat wagon pulled away with more lifeless Russian, and it was time to make my final play and wrap things up nice and neat. I told the flatfoot who'd interviewed me that I was taking a cab to get a drink, and he waved me off absently. But when I got into the cab, I told the driver to get me to the nearest payphone, and off we bustled. I got Woodchuck's secretary again, and something in her tone made me stop before I blathered on about him calling me back. "What's the matter, doll?" I asked, and she huffed. "I shouldn't say anything, but Mr. Woodchuck, well, he canceled his meetings today, said he wasn't feeling well, and he was just going to stay home, but Nancy saw him getting into a cab with the mailroom girl. And well, it's just not proper." Whatever she said from that point on, the blag failed to carry across the distance as my shoes burned rubber and the cabbie honked his horn as I passed by him at near light speed. I think he must have thought I was trying to get out of the fair. Either that or else he just wanted to be the first person to see a human being outrun a yellow cab at top speed. Or maybe he was just in the mood for a good chase scene. No matter which way you sliced bread, eventually he caught up with me, rolling down his window in spite of the sonic cracks my coattails were making as they snapped in the breeze, and he yelled for me to get in. Realizing I would never get anywhere in time on my feet, not to mention that it's hard to smoke a much-needed cigarette while impersonating a cheetah, I jumped back in the car and told him Woodchuck's address, punctuating it with, "Get there yesterday and it's a Benjamin for you." Apparently, the secret to interstellar space travel is a well-proffered Benjamin. Woodchuck's apartment building was one of those "let's all die in the fire" contraptions where you needed to buzz 80 doors to get through and everyone goes about their business slow as molasses down a window in Alaska. I left the cab while it was still moving, sailing through the air with the grace of a well-oiled cat. My sawbuck and the extra Franklin whipped through the window at the caddy. My fingers banged the buzzer for Woodchuck's place, but he didn't answer, and after 2 rings I began pushing buttons for all the other residents. Someone was bound to answer. And answer they did. A little old lady, some snot-nosed young punk, a dame that sounded like she was partying with about 9 gorillas. Each time I responded with a delivery for and used the name on the board, but it wasn't till the party lady that I got my favorite response. "Come on up," she said, and the door buzzed open. And I took flight, pounding up the stairs like John Wayne, about to parley with Cochise. I didn't know what I would find when I got to Woodchuck's door, but I was afraid that if she hadn't done it already, Samantha was about to give him the long kill goodnight, and that would be extremely inconvenient for both my employer and my bank account. I got to the 5th floor landing, gasping like an old radiator that had been shot a few times, and sped down the carpeted hall to Woodchuck's door. The walls in this place were all cream color and peaches with scarlet accents, and there were armchairs and doilies and lampshade knickknacks. A firm knock on Woodchuck's door, and a shout from me, "Woodchuck, you in there?" produced a sort of gasp sound from inside, just barely audible, and I silently hoped that I wasn't about to ruin the night of a man with a maid, as Costello might have put it. With a grunt, like bull, to quote my dead Rusky friend, I put my shoulder to the door and it cracked with a sound like a gunshot, but it didn't bust in. I leaped a few steps back and then burst forward again, putting all of my weight and machismo behind it, and this time the door went flying, wood splintering. My momentum carried me forward and I tripped over the carpet and went down on one knee, catching myself from a complete faceplant with one hand, my other hand already gripping retribution. I had a moment or two of clarity, filled to the brim full of wide-eyed stares exchanged with Woodchuck, who was on a couch at the opposite side of the room, his chubby face red, sweat streaming down his brow. Angelface was standing beside him, staring at me with a mixture of fright and fury, and she had never looked more ethereal. One of her hands was gripping his jaw in an unkind fashion. The other hand was holding a syringe to his neck. She screamed something primal, without words but incredibly well spelled out, and I fired a warning shot into the wall near her head. Like a feral cat, she just bounced away from Woodchuck, who also screamed, and the syringe flew from her gloved hand. Trouble was, she sprang towards me, and before I could say "Hiawatha," she bowled me over with a kick to my collarbone that sent me sprawling, and then she slipped through the door. I sprang to my feet and turned to Woodchuck, but Filbert was already waving me away with a limp hand, his pallor like that of a fresh canvas. The sweat glistened on his brow as the poor man rasped, "Get after her!" and I was off like a shot. Angelface, or Samantha if you prefer, was already halfway down the flight of stairs from Woodchuck's floor. Without thinking, I plunged over the railing and dropped to the stairs below, dropping in front of Samantha with my customary cat-like grace. She immediately whipped around, charging back up the stairs, and led me on a chase up another flight and down a long hall to a door marked "Fire Exit." If I'd been listening to my well-developed sense of certain doom, I'd have heard it yodeling.